looking just at a group of friends in my living room or something. This is wonderful. I think everyone probably has been following what's been going on, and no one can say Dobbs without getting chills.
One thing that, to put it in perspective, my mother was born without the right to vote, but my two daughters have less rights than I have, which is unbelievable. That they have, I have more control over making decisions over my health care and my body than they literally have with these decisions that are coming out. Because Article 5 of the Constitution calls for three things and one secretarial action. 2/3 vote in the House, 2/3 vote in the Senate, ratified by 38 states, certified by the archivist. So we've done that. We finally in 2020 got Virginia was the last state. We are very close to making it happen. And you don't know what's going to happen in an election. You have absolutely no idea. We could lose the Senate, we could lose the House, we could lose the presidency, and then we would never see it in our lifetime. So I feel an urgency. I feel like if we don't get it in these next 2 years, the degree of probability could turn against us.
So one of the things that I think we keep coming up against is this idea of women thinking, well, we have all the rights. We can, I mean, before Dobbs, the response that I got from a lot of people, you have all the rights. But just explain why it's a patchwork and it is so fragile. It's a house of cards, because we now know with Dobbs that the only thing that will protect us is an amendment to the Constitution so that we can fight these things on equal ground. But before Dobbs, there was this concept of, well, we got the 14th Amendment,
So thank you so much. I love Marcy, just an incredible thought partner, but also one of my favorite humans. We can all agree. So thank you for this event, and thank you to the Women's Forum. So I was walking over here and sweating, because why is it 100 degrees out? And it made me think about, I think about the ERA in a number of different ways, but it's sort of like climate change. It's this fundamental thing that it's like clean air or water or whatever conditions we need to sustain life. Like women need basic equality, dignity, education, resources, whatever it is we need to just help to sustain humanity. And so in that sense, when things are good in America, when we're the superpower and when all of us were so well-resourced and we have all the privilege in the world, we just don't feel it when things get bad, but things are bad. And now with the pandemic and with all of our rights under threat, with the Supreme Court empowered to do all sorts of things against women, the cracks are surfacing, right? And so it's not that the threats have never been there, it's just that I think that there were other conditions that sort of blinded us to the fact that they have always been percolating underneath. I need to believe in something. And I think that it's not about what do we need to do to fix it, it's about it's inevitable. It's just basic equality. We can't avoid it. We need to figure out how to avoid people becoming empowered to create these barriers in our way. But I think that there's no other way to go. It's in the Constitution, as Carolyn Maloney says. It's past all the constitutional requirements. And I have the note about the filibuster too is that it's a really high bar. Article 5 it would be really impossible to amend the Constitution today, but the ERA has achieved that. It's 2 supermajority requirements in Congress, 2/3 of Congress, and 3/4 of state legislatures have to ratify it. That's 2 supermajority requirements. So then to put a filibuster, a 3rd supermajority requirement onto this amendment is really interesting to me. It's kind of discriminatory against women, because other constitutional amendments to our Constitution are not subject to extra requirements like we are, right?
It's also an interesting moment in time because of this backlash, we're looking at states, and in New York State, we were able to have the requirement for an amendment in New York State. What are there now? 25 states that have a state equal rights amendment. Mm-hmm. And one of the strategies during the frustration building up to first getting Nevada to pass and Illinois was this idea that maybe the way to go is to just work with states and get each state to have their own ERA if we can't accomplish it Maybe you could speak to that, because now in New York State, finally we're going to have it in the general election. We're going to have the ERA to vote on, which took a considerable amount of time. But maybe, Katherine, if you could start on that and just give us an overview of what's happening in the states and how that might fill, some of the optimism half full, the glass half full.
Well, in the 70s, when the ERA was passed by Congress and sent to the states, there was also a wave of state ERAs that were passed across the country. People felt like, well, if we're going to amend the federal constitution, let's also amend our state constitution and add explicit state protections, sex equality protections in our state constitutions. And so this happened in a number of states, and then a few more over time have done so. New York State's a little late to the party.
As we reeled off those protected classes, I was hearing Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Well, first of all, Title VII is a statute.
Okay.
It could be repealed any day,
Okay.
right? The Constitution is something that is permanent. And so that is an incredibly important thing.
Yes.
It is our founding and definitional doctrine and document, and it reflects who we are as a people. So it has both symbolic but also material differences. The biggest problem about why we are not currently protected, whether it's under Title VII or under the existing equality protections in the Constitution, in the 14th Amendment, that prohibits, that promises the equal protection of the laws, is that we have an approach to equality in the United States, whether it's under Title VII or under the Constitution as it's written right now, that is supposedly, in a bit of an outdated term, but I'll use it, colorblind and sex blind. It means that we can't consider a person's race, we can't consider a person's sex, their national origin, their religion, etc., in doling out social goods and bads. What it does is it makes it impossible for us to address structural forms of disadvantage with race-conscious measures, with sex-conscious measures, with measures that are designed to redistribute advantage in ways that are equality enhancing, not equality denying. A quick example that is, I think, the most salient example to explain why our current constitutional equality protections are inadequate, and the protections that we have in the Constitution, which are higher for race discrimination, are also inadequate. During the beginning of Biden's presidency, Congress passed a COVID stimulus package, sending out gobs of money to certain economic sectors that have been hurt most by the pandemic. The restaurant industry, to women and people of color owned restaurants in the first 21 days. Everybody else is gonna get a check too. We're just fast tracking it money to the people who need it the most. Anthony Vitolo, a guy who owned a bar and grill in Tennessee, a white guy, sued and said, this is discrimination against me as a man and as a white person. And he won, and he took the entire program down. The Equal Protection Clause as we have it now has been a greater defender of the rights of white men than it has been of women and people of color, because we take this race-blind and sex-blind approach to what equality means. And part of what's magnificent about a 28th Amendment that is passed in the 21st century is that we can update what equality means in our Constitution from what it meant in the 19th century, when the Equal Protection Clause was added to the Constitution. We are so behind every other peer country in the world and international legal norms about what equality means. We don't in this country have a notion of substantive equality, meaning what are the outcomes of these policies? What we do instead is try to isolate people who are intending to discriminate, who intended to be sexist or racist, and then you have to prove that intent in order to make out a claim of discrimination, rather than looking at a system, a structure, a factual reality on the ground where women are paid so much less than men are. Our access to health care is so little. Are the ways in which we can accumulate wealth through home ownership and all sorts of things. Women-owned business, who sits on boards, all those sorts of things. The facts speak for themselves, but they don't amount to discrimination that the law can remedy in the existing system we have today. And what the 28th Amendment could do is update our laws and our conception of equality or inequality so that we could address in a structural way the ways in which our second-class status is locked in to the way the economy is organized at this point. Does that help answer your question? Good.
How would, assuming that the ERA was passed before the Dobbs decision, how would that have changed the outcome? How would that have affected?
Great question.
So the question of sex discrimination was actually not before the court in Dobbs. It was part of the case below in the lower courts. But when the question went all the way to the Supreme Court, they didn't take the sex discrimination question. They just took the question of whether the law that was at issue violated Roe versus Wade, and should the court continue to uphold Roe versus Wade. So they didn't have to address the sex equality issue.
And I think that really the sky is the limit. I mean, in terms of our model policy agenda, we think about it in terms of different buckets that are sort of fall under the traditional ways of thinking about gender justice, right? Employment, pregnancy discrimination, childcare, reproductive rights, economic empowerment. Part of the language of the ERA, the second section of it, beyond this first section, is that Congress is empowered to create legislation to implement this. Meaning, we want Congress to run with it. We want Congress to think creatively about this moment and to be maximally strategic about what it means to have equity for women once and for all.